When I was young, Granddad used to tell me stories about the grove where he grew up. I always pictured it as the sort of place you'd find in the movie Fern Gully, this sort of magical, timeless place where fairy tales really did come true. There were lily-of-the-valley as big as pool umbrellas, where sprites liked to dance and play, and when allowed, he and his sister Melinda would join. The flowers smelled like love, and the rain smelled fresher than it did in the city where Mom and Dad worked, and where I would go to school. Our own house resided in a suburb outside New York City, on the edge of a great forest where ogres and nymphs and fairies alike lived in peace. He said he himself had lived in a gingerbread house next to 2 tall oak trees with his parents and sisters, and grew magical plants that tasted sweeter than sugar itself. When I was 6, Granddad told me that he himself was an elf, explaining his short, stout frame and cheerful demeanor. When he was drifting off, looking out the window at a place far over my head, I would sneak a glimpse to see if his ears were really pointed. That would prove it for sure. I never did get a good look, but the one time I did, I could swear that the telltale point was right there, peeking out from his white-as-snow wisps of hair. In 1st grade, I could read at a 5th grade reading level and was insanely proud of it. I buried myself in books that Granddad and I would check out of the library and return the next day, sometimes even that same afternoon. I wanted to be a princess in a far-off gully just like the land Granddad had known. I asked him time and time again to take me and show me the toadstools as high as houses, and the other elves just like him. I wanted to see the sprites that he always said would love to braid my long chocolate hair just like they did to Melinda. He would place a daisy crown on my head and tell me, "Someday, little one, someday." On the night of my 7th birthday, after my cake in celebration, he tucked me in and asked me if I could keep a secret. "Of course," I whispered back, eager to see what this jovial elf would produce. He reached into his tweed blazer pocket and produced a tiny vial with an ornate wooden top that seemed as if it were sealed shut. My mother's father gave this to her when she turned 7. 7 is a magical age, and it deserves a magical present. He dove back into his pocket and pulled out a gold chain and then proceeded to hook the two together. "Now, you don't always have to wear this around your neck, but you must always promise to keep it safe, okay?" "But what is it?" There was a faint shimmer inside the jar, but in the dim light of my bedroom I couldn't see it clearly. This is fairy dust. As long as you have this, you will always believe." He folded the tiny package into my hand and then kissed me on the forehead, then settled onto the end of my bed for a nightly story. I would treasure it forever. He filled my head with endless wonder, replacing the threat of bad dreams with the anticipation of princes and princesses and magic, most importantly magic, until I drifted off to sleep. He always made it seem like he would live forever, but as I grew older that seemed to become less and less realistic. Nonetheless, I still believed every fairy tale he told me, from his own invincibility to the valley and back. Age 12, and I was the only kid I knew that still believed in stupid things like the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. And then there was the day that I was wrong, and I knew it as soon as I walked in the door and my mother was in the kitchen cooking. Although she was a wonderful woman and a better mother, she only cooked when something was wrong or someone had died. I dropped my backpack and moved cautiously toward her, attempting to read her by looking at her body language. Her 2 tense shoulders, head arched, hyper-focused on the bowl of mac and cheese she was stirring under her arm. Creak! The floorboard gave me away, and my mother whipped around to face me, hurriedly attempting to fix herself. Her eyes were swollen and red, and her hair was stuck to her face, and I knew he was gone, so I let my knees collapse and fell upon myself on the floor and let the tears come. After the funeral, Dad insisted I go to therapy. He was so afraid that Granddad's death would send me spiraling like my grandmother had after the death of her sister. That was why Granddad had lived with us as long as I could remember. He was stronger than my grandmother, but my dad could never stand the thought of him being alone. After a couple weeks, it seemed evident to my therapist that I was, in fact, okay. I was grief-stricken, but that was to be expected. After that, I was only required to visit once a month. In my spare time, I tried not to think about him. 2 months later, I turned 13. I pushed the fairy tales away. I took all my stories and my fairy dust and shoved them into a box that I then buried deep under my bed. I was in middle school now, and none of my friends believed, so why should I? What good was it to act like a kid if I wasn't anymore? I so badly wanted not to believe, but I still did. This became extremely evident on a Sunday morning when Dad and I were boxing up Granddad's stuff, and I found a little wooden chest marked Ruby in gold embossed letters. I dove at the box and practically ripped it open, forgetting for a minute how old and mature I was. Inside was a map and a letter marked Ruby's 13th birthday. Tearing through the envelope, I was filled with the same sense of excitement that had left me in the previous months. I knew what this could be. Anxiously, I began to read to myself. Dear Ruby, what an important day. Today you open a new chapter of your life, with new friends and lots of new experiences. Such a day should be marked with something special. With this letter, there is a map of the forest with directions of how to reach the valley. Be careful, don't go alone, and remember that you're never too old to believe. I still love you with all of my heart. Granddad. My heart was in my throat. I could feel it beating faster than hummingbird wings against my chest as I unrolled the map. It was real. It was all real. I was so excited that I found myself throwing things haphazardly into my pack. My phone, a flashlight, a camera, a compass, and a jacket in case it was chilly. Then I raced downstairs and grabbed nourishment for my journey. A banana, an apple, and a granola bar would suffice. Dad! I yelled up the stairs. I'm going out! I barely heard his affirmative over the sound of my boot zippers and the slamming of the back door behind me. The map started at my swing set and headed north into the woods. It said to walk north until I hit a tree with an arrow carved into it, and then to turn right and follow the path. I walked on until the orange-marked tree, and then turned left and began to walk on my way to the 2 pink-marked oak trees that marked the entrance to the valley. I felt the sun warm me through the budding leaves on the canopy of trees, and I smiled. Spring had always brought a magic with it that I couldn't explain. The smells themselves created an illusion. The earth smelled fresh and wet, and ready to support life again after the cold of winter. There must have been a lilac in someone's yard, because its perfume wafted through the forest to me, filling me with a warmth that I cannot explain. Before I knew it, I was there, at the foot of 2 oaks. I'm not sure what I expected to see. I didn't expect the house to be still standing. After all, it was made of gingerbread, even with magic. I turned to the left of the trees and saw a small overhang which made a small burrow structure. It was too large to be rabbits, although it could have been a fox den, or perhaps it was just the product of centuries of erosion. My eyes swept the rest of the valley. For some strange reason, there were no trees inside the small valley, only around it. I couldn't see much else, though. From where I stood, the valley just looked unkempt. Leaves, vines of bittersweet, and other low briars tangled to make a thorny carpet over the forest floor. Nowhere were the fabled lily of the valley, nowhere were the sprites or the fairies, the ogres or the nymphs. All I could see was an abundance of nothing where my fairy tale should have been. I stayed for a while, searching and hoping to find some evidence that the stories I had held so close as a child existed, and weren't just lies. I even circled around the valley, still hopeful. Mostly, though, I was confused. Granddad had always told the stories like where they were the truth, and so for the first time I questioned whether or not he was who he had said he was. It sounded silly to me then that it was only the first time that I had questioned the validity of his identity, and then it hit me like a shockwave, colliding with me and reverberating back through the forest, leaving complete and utter silence in its wake. Everything, all of Granddad's stories were just that, stories. Tales, fables, lies. My entire life, my closest friend had lied to me. It took me a very long time to figure out why. I forgave my grandfather after a while, but the fact that he died and I couldn't even talk to him about my feelings stung the most. What had he been planning for my 13th birthday? Was he planning to launch me from my childhood head first into the world? Or did he have some grand scheme filled with props and giant flowers to keep me believing well into my teens or even my 20s? And now, at 29, I do understand. I understand exactly why Granddad did what he did. When I was young, my parents were always determined to do the best for me that they could, even if that meant both of them working 40-plus hour weeks and even hours on the weekend. As a child, I was lonely. My grandfather was my best and only friend, so he filled my head with words and magic and a thirst for knowledge and something more. Something fantastic and wonderful and full of life. Sophie is 5. Her father didn't see her born. He was too busy with his former mistress, now fiancé, to care what his old fiancé was doing. By my estimates, I was 2 months pregnant when he left, and I never cared to tell him. Sophie is also a very lonely little girl who spends a lot of time with her grandparents, so that I can work double shifts and give Sophie at least part of what she deserves. And I understand. I understand why, in a world like this one, Granddad chose to fill my head with stories and hopes and dreams rather than letting me face the music of a world where happy endings only happen in books. Sophie, I call. She looks at me inquisitively from her spot on the carpet. I reach for a golden chain deep inside my pocket. This was my grandfather's. I want you to have it. The look of wonder on her face fills me with such a jubilant feeling that suddenly I want nothing more than for her to have the childhood I did. I hesitate, but then the words fill me, and I know right where to start. You know, once upon a time there lived an old elf.